She spent her career on her knees at crime scenes. Not metaphorically. Literally on her knees with brushes, with cameras, with oblique lighting rigs, coaxing evidence out of surfaces that looked like nothing to everyone else. Maureen O'Connell was a special agent with the FBI's evidence response team, one of the most elite forensic units in the country. She was not a detective. She was not a profiler. She was the person who processed the scene after the detectives cleared the tape. She was trained to see what other investigators missed. And when the drone footage from Nancy Guthrie's property was released, footage that had this entire community pausing and rewinding and analyzing every frame, Maureen O'Connell did what she was trained to do. She looked at the driveway. Not the back gate, not the front door, not the windows or the flower pots or the door frame. The driveway. And what she found, or rather what she did not find, is a question she has been asking since day one of her analysis. On day 67 of the Nancy Guthrie investigation, Brian Entine sat down with Maureen O'Connell. And what she said in that interview has not gotten nearly enough attention from the broader coverage of this case. The very first thing I looked at was I was looking for tire impressions on the driveway. I only saw one set from the moment that drone went up. Before we examine what former FBI Evidence Response Team agent Maureen O'Connell discovered when she analyzed the driveway at Nancy Guthrie's property, and why she believes critical tire impression evidence may have been missed or lost in the critical early hours of the investigation, make sure you're subscribed to True Crime Vault and have notifications turned on. We bring you analysis from credentialed forensic experts like Maureen O'Connell, who spent careers processing the most complex crime scenes in the country. Hit that subscribe button right now. Smash the like button to support coverage that brings real FBI forensic expertise to understanding what happened to Nancy. Drop a comment telling us whether you think tire evidence from the circle driveway could identify the vehicle that took her. Your engagement helps this reach people who might have critical information. And if you know anything about this case, contact FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI or Pima County Sheriff at 520-351-4900. Over $1 million in reward money is waiting. Now let's examine exactly what Maureen O'Connell saw when she analyzed Nancy's driveway and why her professional assessment raises critical questions about evidence preservation. If you've been following this channel, you know that Brian Entine has been one of the only journalists doing sustained on-the-ground reporting on this case. He has the access. He has the contacts. He has been in Tucson asking the questions that other outlets have not been asking. And on day 67, he had O'Connell. O'Connell served as a special agent on the FBI's evidence response team. Let me be clear about what that means because it matters for everything that follows. The Evidence Response Team, the ERT, is the FBI's dedicated forensic unit. These are the agents who are called in for the most complex, the most sensitive, the highest stakes crime scene processing in the country. Presidential events, mass casualty incidents, federal crimes where the evidence is so critical, so fragile, so contested that you cannot afford to get it wrong. Where a procedural error at the scene is not just an embarrassment, it is a case-ending failure. ERT agents go through specialized training that covers a wide spectrum of forensic disciplines: blood spatter analysis, digital forensics, latent print recovery, trace evidence collection. And within that world, tire impression analysis is not a footnote. It is a core discipline. ERT agents are trained to find, photograph, preserve, cast, and analyze tire impressions in conditions ranging from the straightforward to the deeply complicated. O'Connell was not a commentator offering an informal take to a friendly audience. She was a practitioner offering a professional forensic assessment to a reporter, on the record, by name, about a real missing persons case. That distinction matters enormously, and it is the reason her observations deserve to be treated with the seriousness that they carry. The training that ERT agents receive is not casual. It is not a weekend seminar. It is intensive, ongoing, specialized instruction that takes years to complete and requires agents to maintain proficiency through regular recertification and practical exercises. When O'Connell speaks about tire impression evidence, she is speaking from a foundation of thousands of hours of training and practical experience, processing real scenes where the evidence she recovered contributed to convictions, to exonerations, to solving cases that had been cold for years. Her credentials are not theoretical. They are operational. She has been the person kneeling in decomposed granite in Arizona desert heat, with oblique lighting rigs trying to capture impressions before the surface degrades. She has been the person testifying in federal court about the reliability of tire impression analysis and defending her methodology against defense attorneys who specialize in challenging forensic evidence. She knows this discipline at the level where theory meets reality and where mistakes have consequences. When someone with that background looks at drone footage of a crime scene and says, "I was looking for tire impression work and I did not see it," that statement carries weight. It is not idle commentary. It is professional assessment based on what should be visible if that work was conducted during the window when the drone was operational. Now, if you've been watching this series from the beginning, you know the layout of Nancy Guthrie's property in Tucson. But let's reorient, because this driveway detail is about to carry a significant amount of weight in what follows. Nancy Guthrie's home has what is commonly called a circle driveway, a curved looping driveway at the front of the property that allows a vehicle to pull in, loop around, and exit without reversing. This is a practical feature. It is common in properties of this type in the Southwest, and most of the time it is just a driveway. But let's think about it for a moment from a different angle. A circle driveway is designed for convenience, but it is also, from a purely tactical standpoint, designed for a quick exit. You pull in, you do what you need to do, you leave. You do not back out into traffic. You do not have to reverse down a residential street where someone might see you. You do not have to make a three-point turn that requires multiple maneuvers and creates multiple opportunities for witnesses to notice your vehicle or memorize your license plate. You leave forward-facing at speed the moment you decide you want to leave, with full visibility forward, with no awkward maneuvering to execute, with no delay between decision and departure. If someone was planning to remove Nancy Guthrie from her home quickly, quietly, against her will, in a way that minimized the time the vehicle spent in a compromised position visible from the street or from neighboring properties, a circle driveway is exactly where you would want to stage that vehicle. Pull in, load, roll forward, gone. The entire operation could take less than 2 minutes from vehicle arrival to vehicle departure if executed efficiently. O'Connell said as much. She told Brian Enton directly that the circle driveway at the front of the property is where she believes the vehicle that transported Nancy was positioned. The circle driveway is where I think the car pulled up to get her. I know the back doors were gated, but I think something happened that caused them to go out the front. And maybe it was that dog barking in the back. Who knows? And this is not a casual opinion from someone who watched some drone footage and had a thought. This is the considered professional assessment of a career forensic investigator who has spent her life reconstructing what happened at scenes, working backward from the physical evidence to the human actions that left it. O'Connell has processed abduction scenes. She has processed homicide scenes. She has processed scenes where vehicles were used to transport victims, and where tire evidence became the critical link between the crime and the perpetrators. She understands how perpetrators think about vehicle staging, how they balance speed against exposure, how they make operational decisions about entry and exit routes. When she looks at Nancy's property and analyzes the layout, the access points, the visibility from the street, the tactical advantages and disadvantages of different staging locations, she is not guessing. She is applying a framework of understanding built from hundreds of cases where similar operational decisions were made and where the evidence revealed what worked and what failed. So the immediate question is, why the front? We know there is a back gate. We have spent significant time on this channel on the back of the property, the rear access, the staging theory around the back door. Why is a trained FBI forensic agent looking at the available evidence and pointing to the circle driveway at the front of the house? This is where O'Connell's theory gets operationally specific, and it involves something that at first glance sounds almost too mundane to be significant. A dog. The property adjacent to or near Nancy's home has a dog, and according to O'Connell's analysis of the situation and the evidence, that dog may have been a factor in how this abduction unfolded. I tied it in my head to that dog of the neighbors because, a squeak is a very high-pitched sound, and a high-pitched sound travels, and I'm wondering if that's what the dog heard initially. Dogs bark at unfamiliar people. Dogs bark at unfamiliar vehicles that do not belong in a neighborhood where they know the regular patterns of who comes and goes. They bark at unusual sounds and smells and presences that are out of the ordinary pattern of the neighborhood. Dogs are territorial. They are protective. They are alert to changes in their environment that humans might not consciously register, and in a quiet residential neighborhood in Tucson, at whatever hour this took place, likely the very early morning hours between 2 and 3 a.m., when most residents are asleep and the ambient noise level is minimal, a dog barking persistently at a vehicle parked in the rear alley of a property is exactly the kind of thing that attracts attention. It gets a curtain pulled back by a neighbor who wakes up and wonders what the disturbance is. It gets a porch light turned on by someone stepping to their window to see what's causing the commotion. It gets someone stepping outside onto their back patio or their driveway to see what the dog is reacting to, possibly with a phone in hand ready to call police if they see something suspicious. Dogs barking in the middle of the night are not ignored in residential neighborhoods, especially in communities like the Catalina foothills, where residents are security conscious and aware of their surroundings. A persistently barking dog is a spotlight. It is the opposite of stealth. It is exactly what someone attempting a covert abduction does not want. O'Connell's professional read is that something, possibly the dog, possibly another disturbance or unanticipated development at the rear of the property, caused the people involved to change their plan. The driver came up on the circle driveway instead, and then they went out the front door. Part of the plan was to remove Nancy via the front door. This is significant because it suggests operational flexibility. It suggests that whoever did this had the presence of mind to recognize when the original plan was compromised and the ability to pivot to an alternative exit strategy quickly without panicking or abandoning the operation entirely. That level of adaptability suggests planning. It suggests they had thought through multiple scenarios. It suggests they were not amateurs improvising everything in the moment, but rather people who had considered what to do if the rear exit became non-viable. And the circle driveway, being the front of the property and open to the street, is exactly where a vehicle would leave tire impressions in the decomposed granite surface. Now I want to be precise here because O'Connell was precise. This is a professional forensic assessment based on the available evidence, the drone footage she analyzed, and her extensive knowledge of how abductions are operationally planned and executed. She was not presenting this as confirmed investigative fact. She was presenting it as her reading of the situation, the most operationally coherent explanation for what the physical evidence, as she understood it, suggested. But she was direct enough about it that it deserves to be taken seriously. And when someone with her background points at a specific location on a property and says that is where I think the vehicle was, that is worth following to its full forensic implications. Here is where this gets technically critical, and this is the part of O'Connell's analysis that has been almost entirely absent from the broader coverage of this case. The part that this audience needs to fully understand to appreciate the stakes of what she is describing. Nancy Guthrie's driveway is not concrete. It is not asphalt or pavers or any of the sealed hard surfaces you might find in a different region or a more recently built suburban development. Nancy's driveway is composed of decomposed granite, and that specific surface material, that material right there under the tires of every vehicle that comes and goes from that property, is everything for understanding the evidence problem that O'Connell is raising. Her driveway is made of decomposed granite, which is very, very difficult to develop a tire impression. Decomposed granite, commonly called DG, is a naturally occurring material formed when granite rock weathers and breaks down over time into a loose granular aggregate. It is extraordinarily common in desert landscaping across the American Southwest. In Tucson, in Phoenix, in Scottsdale, in Albuquerque, in Palm Springs, in Las Vegas, it handles the heat. It is permeable to rainfall, allowing water to soak through rather than pooling on the surface or creating runoff problems. It requires minimal maintenance compared to grass or other landscaping materials that need constant watering in desert climates. It looks appropriate and natural in a desert environment, fitting the aesthetic of Southwestern architecture and xeriscape design principles. Hundreds of thousands of properties in Arizona use it as a primary surface material for driveways, walkways, patios, and decorative landscaping. For homeowners and landscape designers, decomposed granite is an ideal material. It is cost-effective, environmentally appropriate for water conservation, visually appealing, and functional for vehicle traffic and pedestrian use. Forensically, though, decomposed granite presents very specific and very significant problems for evidence recovery. The core issue is this: DG is not fixed. It is a loose, shifting, granular material. It compacts under pressure, under a vehicle's tires, under foot traffic. But that compaction is not permanent and is easily disrupted. When a vehicle drives over decomposed granite, it does leave a tire impression. The weight of the vehicle presses down on the granules, creating a pattern that corresponds to the tire's contact surface. The tread pattern, the individual characteristics of the tire, the pressure distribution across the contact patch, all of this creates a compression pattern in the DG that theoretically can be documented and analyzed. But that impression, unlike an impression in wet soil or mud or clay, is fragile. It can be disturbed by subsequent foot traffic crossing over the same area. It can be shifted by another vehicle driving over the impression, further compacting some areas and disrupting others. It can be broken down by wind, which is a constant presence in Tucson and which moves loose granular material across surfaces, especially during the spring months when wind speeds increase. It can be degraded by rain, although rain is less frequent in Tucson than wind, but when it occurs, it can wash away or redistribute the granular material. And in a desert environment where temperature cycling causes material movement, where the surface heats dramatically during the day and cools at night, causing expansion and contraction of the material, the window for recovering that impression before it degrades is not generous. There is also the issue of visual complexity. Decomposed granite has a naturally irregular, heterogeneous surface texture. It does not look like smooth mud where a tire impression stands out clearly to the naked eye as a distinct pattern pressed into a uniform surface. In DG, the impression exists. The compaction pattern is there. The tire did compress the granules in a specific pattern that corresponds to its tread, but it can be nearly invisible without the right conditions and the right equipment, because the surrounding surface is already irregular and granular and visually complex. The impression blends into the natural texture of the material. You can stand directly over it and not see it unless you know exactly what you are looking for and how to create the conditions that make it visible. Which brings us to the photographic challenge. Tire impressions in decomposed granite do not photograph the way tire impressions in mud or soil do. You cannot walk up to a driveway, point a camera at the ground in normal daylight, and capture an image that is forensically useful. The surface does not work that way under standard lighting conditions. The impression is there, but the camera cannot capture it because there is insufficient contrast between the compressed areas and the uncompressed areas under normal ambient light. The key technique O'Connell referenced, the technique that forensic photographers use specifically for granular surfaces and for impression evidence in challenging materials, is oblique lighting. A really good photographer and a great set of scales, and you move your light source from all different kinds of oblique lightings because the oblique lighting will pick up the ridge detail on the impression. Oblique lighting means positioning a light source at a very low angle relative to the surface you are photographing, almost parallel to it, raking across it so that the light creates shadows in any depressions or raised areas in the surface. When you do this, features that are completely invisible under normal overhead or ambient light suddenly become visible, because the shadows they cast under the raking light create contrast that the camera can capture. The compressed areas of the tire impression create subtle elevation changes in the granular surface. Some granules are pressed down. Some are displaced to the sides. The tread pattern creates ridges and depressions that are measured in millimeters. Under normal lighting, these elevation changes are invisible, or nearly so. But under oblique lighting, where the light source is positioned at a severe angle, those millimeter-level elevation changes cast shadows. And those shadows create contrast. And that contrast is what the camera captures. You have probably experienced this principle in everyday life without thinking about it forensically. If you have ever tried to see footprints in a carpet by holding a flashlight parallel to the floor, you have used oblique lighting. The footprints that were invisible in normal room light, invisible under overhead lighting or sunlight coming through a window, become clearly visible the moment you get that light source low and let it rake across the pile of the carpet. The compressed areas of the carpet where someone stepped create elevation changes that cast shadows under the raking light. Suddenly you can see exactly where someone walked, which direction they were moving, whether they were wearing shoes or were barefoot, how many people crossed the carpet. The same principle applies to tire impressions in granular surfaces. The light at an angle creates shadows. The shadows create contrast. The contrast reveals the impression. Without oblique lighting or an equivalent technique, Tire impressions in decomposed granite are extremely difficult or impossible to photograph in a way that produces results that are forensically useful and legally defensible. You might know the impression is there based on your understanding of what happened at the scene. You might even be able to see it if you get on your knees and look at the surface at exactly the right angle in exactly the right ambient light, tilting your head so that your line of sight is nearly parallel to the surface, using the natural angle of sunlight at a specific time of day to create some shadowing. But capturing it in a photograph that can be measured, compared to known tire patterns, and introduced as evidence in court is another matter entirely. The photograph has to meet evidentiary standards. It has to be clear enough that a forensic examiner can identify tread characteristics. It has to be scaled so that measurements are accurate. It has to be documented in a way that establishes chain of custody and demonstrates that the impression was photographed as found without alteration or enhancement beyond standard forensic photography techniques. And photographing the impression correctly is only the beginning. You also need scale. A calibrated ruler or measurement scale bar placed in the frame at the same plane as the impression. A ruler is a scale. That's what I'm talking about when I say a scale. You know, those little rulers next to a fingerprint or something like that. Well, we have the long ones for the tire impressions. The scale has to be positioned correctly, at the same plane as the impression, not above it or angled relative to it, because any perspective distortion will make the measurements inaccurate. The scale has to be visible in the frame so that anyone looking at the photograph later can verify the dimensions of the features being documented. And the scale has to be included in every photograph taken of the impression, because without scale, the photograph has limited forensic value. You can see that a pattern exists, but you cannot measure it accurately enough to compare it to known tire specifications. All of this work, the oblique lighting setup, the scaled photography, the systematic documentation of the surface, the creation of a photographic record that captures the impression from multiple angles with multiple lighting positions to ensure that all tread characteristics are visible, needs to happen before the scene is compromised. Before investigators themselves create new impressions on the surface, they are trying to recover by walking across the driveway to access other areas of the property. Before the scene is processed by anyone who does not understand that this particular surface in this particular location may contain one of the most important pieces of physical evidence in this investigation. Before additional vehicles enter or exit the property for any reason. Before wind or weather or time degrades the impression to the point where it is no longer recoverable. That is the technical framework of what O'Connell was evaluating when she watched the drone footage. And it is the standard against which she assessed what she saw and what she did not see in that footage. O'Connell watched the drone footage and she watched it the way she was trained. Not looking at what was dramatic or immediately visible, not focusing on the front door or the windows or the obvious features that draw the eye, but looking at what was being worked. What investigative process was visible on that scene? Specifically, whether investigators were conducting the kind of careful, systematic, technique-specific evidence collection on the driveway surface that the situation warranted. Were there technicians visible working the driveway? Were there equipment setups that suggested impression photography was being conducted? Was there activity centered on the circle driveway that corresponded to forensic processing rather than general scene documentation? And she did not see in the available drone footage evidence that anyone was working tire impressions in the circle driveway. No oblique lighting equipment visible, the kind of portable rigs ERT agents bring to scenes for exactly this purpose. The stands and light sources and power supplies that are necessary for this specific type of photography. No technicians on their knees at ground level with scales and cameras positioned for impression photography, in the posture that this work requires because you cannot photograph tire impressions effectively from a standing position. No systematic grid-based documentation of the front driveway surface, the kind of methodical coverage that ensures every portion of the surface is examined and photographed. No visible activity centered on the decomposed granite of the circle driveway that corresponded to the kind of impression recovery work O'Connell would expect to see on a scene with this profile. Now, and this is where O'Connell's intellectual honesty becomes important to register, she was careful about this observation. She acknowledged explicitly that the FBI may have done that work at a time when Brian Enton's drone was not overhead. I didn't notice anyone doing any type of capturing any type of impression in the soil out in front. I don't think I ever saw it. The thing is, when the FBI came, they moved us all away. And we did have the drone up. It wasn't up constantly. The FBI may have conducted tire impression work with all of the necessary equipment at 4 a.m. before dawn, when lighting conditions would actually be ideal for oblique lighting work, because you can control artificial light sources more effectively in darkness than in daylight. Or they may have done it before the initial media presence arrived on scene. Or they may have done it during a period of scene access that is not captured in the publicly available footage, during one of the times when media was moved back and the property was being processed without external observation. O'Connell cannot know whether that work happened from what she can see in a drone video shot from above during daylight hours. She was fair about that. She was precise about the limits of what the available evidence allowed her to conclude. She was careful not to overstate her observations or to claim knowledge she does not have, but she did not see it. And that absence, the absence of visible tire impression work in the circle driveway and the footage that is available, is what has been sitting with her since day 67. An experienced ERT agent, looking at a scene, looking for the forensic work that should be visible if the scene was processed as thoroughly as the situation warranted, and not seeing it, not being able to confirm it happened based on what is available for public review. That is the observation that O'Connell put on the record, and it is the foundation of the concern that follows. Subscribe to True Crime Vault and turn on all notifications for continued expert forensic analysis as this investigation develops. Like this video to support coverage that brings real FBI expertise to understanding evidence challenges in this case. Share this video because someone might have information about vehicles in the Catalina foothills on February 1st. Comment with your thoughts on whether tire evidence could still be recovered or analyzed. And if you saw any vehicles in Nancy's neighborhood that night or in the days before, contact FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI or Pima County Sheriff at 520-351-4900. Over $1 million in reward money is waiting for information that leads to Nancy's recovery. Let me bring in the broader context, because what O'Connell is describing is not just about photographs. It is not just about whether a specific forensic technique was applied to a specific surface. It is about timing. And in forensic evidence collection on a scene like this, a high-profile scene, a scene with multiple agencies involved, a scene that was processed under public scrutiny with media presence and community attention, a scene that was released and resealed multiple times as the investigation developed and different needs arose, timing is everything. We know, and this is confirmed public record based on reporting from multiple outlets and observable from the drone footage itself, that Nancy Guthrie's property was not maintained as a continuously sealed, protected crime scene from the moment of discovery through the completion of all evidence collection. The scene was released at some point in the investigation. It was accessed by multiple parties for multiple purposes. Family members needed access to retrieve personal items or to secure the property. Utility workers may have needed access for maintenance or to shut off services. Additional investigative work required return visits as new information developed or as different forensic specialties became involved. The property was the center of activity in the early days of a high-profile missing persons investigation that drew significant attention and resources. Vehicles came and went from that property. Investigators moved through it. Media was present at the perimeter. The operational reality of the early phase of this investigation meant that the property was not hermetically preserved behind crime scene tape for weeks on end, with no one entering and nothing disturbing the physical evidence. Now think about what that means for a tire impression in decomposed granite. Every foot of traffic that crosses that driveway surface disturbs the granular material. Every step compresses some granules and displaces others. Every investigator walking from their vehicle to the front door, every technician carrying equipment across the driveway to access different areas of the property, every person who crosses that surface for any reason creates disturbance. Every vehicle that enters or exits, and in the critical early days of this investigation, there were vehicles entering and exiting that property regularly. Law enforcement vehicles, forensic vehicles, possibly media vehicles before the perimeter was established, compresses and shifts the DG. The weight of each vehicle creates new compression patterns. The tires create new impressions that overlay or intersect with previous impressions. Every disturbance potentially degrades, alters, or destroys a tire impression that may have been left in that surface by the vehicle that transported Nancy. The question at the center of O'Connell's concern is this: how early in the investigation did anyone identify the circle driveway as a potential vehicle staging location? And how quickly was that specific surface, That decomposed granite circle driveway, secured and protected specifically for forensic impression recovery. If investigators identified the circle driveway as a staging location on day 1, in the first hours of the investigation when the scene was fresh and the evidence was intact, and immediately cordoned off that specific area and kept it protected until ERT could process it properly with oblique lighting and scaled photography, there is a reasonable chance that usable impressions were preserved and documented. But if the significance of the circle driveway was not recognized immediately, if initial investigative focus was on the interior of the house or on the back gate area where the door was found open, if the front driveway was not seen as a priority location for forensic processing in those critical first hours, if the scene was accessed multiple times before anyone was systematically thinking about tire impression recovery in that specific location, the window may have closed quietly without anyone realizing it in time. Evidence does not wait. Decomposed granite does not hold impressions indefinitely while investigators work through other priorities. The surface degrades, the impression fades, the wind blows, people walk, vehicles drive, and every hour that passes without that evidence being documented is an hour closer to that evidence no longer existing in a form that can be recovered. O'Connell did not speculate about the specific timeline. She cannot know from outside the investigation when each piece of the scene was recognized, prioritized, and processed. She does not have access to the investigative file or the forensic reports or the scene documentation that would tell her definitively whether tire impression work was conducted and when and what it yielded. But she raised the concern, and it is a concern that has a precise forensic basis, not an emotional one, not a speculative one, not a criticism of any individual investigator or agency. A practical technical concern about surface degradation and evidence preservation timelines in challenging forensic environments. Let me talk about what the FBI can actually do with a tire impression, a good one recovered correctly in time with proper technique and documentation, because this context is critical for understanding what was potentially at stake on that circle driveway. The FBI maintains comprehensive tire tread databases that allow forensic examiners to compare an impression recovered from a scene to a library of known tread patterns from tire manufacturers. These databases have been built over decades through cooperation with tire manufacturers and through documentation of tires recovered from vehicles involved in crimes. The databases cover a substantial proportion of commercially available passenger vehicle tires, light truck tires, commercial vehicle tires, specialty tires, and even some discontinued tire models that may still be in use on older vehicles. The Bureau has a database filled with every tire impression you can imagine, and we can look at those photographs, and they can make a cursory determination as to whether or not those tire tracks fit that tire. Tire treads function in some ways analogously to fingerprints, not in the sense that every tire is completely unique, because tires are mass-produced and thousands of identical tires of the same model come off the production line, but in the sense that tread patterns are distinctive and identifiable and can be matched to specific manufacturers and models. Different tire manufacturers use different tread designs. Different tire models within the same manufacturer's product line have different tread patterns designed for different purposes. All-season tires have different treads than winter tires. Performance tires have different treads than economy tires. All-terrain truck tires have aggressive tread patterns designed for off-road traction that are distinctively different from highway tires designed for fuel efficiency and quiet ride. From a tire model identification, you narrow the field of vehicles that could have made the impression because different vehicle classes and sizes use different tire categories. A tire impression that tells you the suspect vehicle was using a specific type of all-terrain truck tire with an aggressive tread pattern tells you something meaningful about the vehicle. You are looking at a truck or SUV, not a sedan. You are looking at a vehicle whose owner chose off-road capability, which might tell you something about where they drive or what activities they engage in. You are looking at a tire category that is less common than standard highway tires, which narrows the pool of vehicles you need to investigate. A tire impression that matches a specific sedan tire category tells you something else. You are looking at a passenger vehicle, likely a four-door sedan or similar, not a truck or commercial vehicle. You are looking at something more common, which expands the pool, but also means you can start eliminating trucks and SUVs from your suspect vehicle list. In cases where the impression is of sufficient quality, meaning it was photographed correctly with proper lighting and scaling, and the surface held enough detail, and where the tire has distinctive individual characteristics, Wear patterns from how the vehicle is driven and the tire has worn unevenly, road hazard damage like cuts or punctures or embedded objects, manufacturing irregularities that create unique features in the tread. Forensic examiners can sometimes narrow an identification to a specific tire rather than just a tire type. This is more rare and more contested as evidence because the individuality of tire characteristics is not as scientifically established as fingerprint individuality, but it happens. In cases where a tire has distinctive damage or wear that creates a unique signature, that impression can sometimes be matched to a specific tire on a specific vehicle with enough certainty to support investigative leads or even courtroom testimony. Tire impression analysis is a recognized forensic discipline with a substantial body of supporting case law. It has been accepted as evidence in federal court. It has been used successfully in prosecutions. The FBI's forensic divisions, the Laboratory Division and the Operational Technology Division, have invested significantly in this capability because it works. It produces investigative leads. It narrows suspect pools. It provides evidence that juries understand because everyone knows what a tire track looks like and can understand intuitively that different tires make different marks. O'Connell spent her career in the institutional context where this work is done, where tire impressions are recovered from scenes and sent to the lab for analysis and compared to databases and used to focus investigations. What this means in practical terms is a chain of inference. A clear, well-photographed, properly scaled tire impression from the circle driveway at Nancy's home could potentially tell investigators the tire model. The tire model, matched against the FBI database, narrows the vehicle class. The vehicle class combined with other investigative work, surveillance footage from cameras in the neighborhood showing vehicles that passed by around the time of the abduction, witness accounts from neighbors who may have seen an unfamiliar vehicle, electronic records from license plate readers or traffic cameras or toll systems could produce a specific vehicle description. And a specific vehicle description could be cross-referenced against vehicle registrations, against surveillance footage that captured license plates, against cell phone data that placed specific individuals in the area at the relevant time who own vehicles matching that description, and that leads to specific people. That chain, impression to tire to vehicle to person, does not start without the impression, and the impression starts on the ground in the decomposed granite in the circle driveway, at the moment the scene was still intact enough to hold it.
I want to situate this within the broader evidence framework this series has been building because O'Connell's circle driveway theory does not stand alone in isolation. It connects to something this audience knows well, and that connection makes both theories stronger and more operationally coherent. We have spent significant time in this series on the backdoor staging theory. The evidence suggesting that the rear of Nancy's property was deliberately manipulated, that the back door was left open in a specific way that drew attention, that elements of the rear scene were arranged or disturbed in a pattern that raises questions about staging rather than genuine evidence of how the perpetrators actually exited the property. That thread has been one of the persistent analytical focuses of this investigation from the community's perspective and from expert commentary we have featured on this channel. Here is how the two theories fit together, not as contradictions, not as competing explanations that require you to choose one or the other, but as a coherent operational picture of a crime that included misdirection. If the back of the property was staged as deliberate misdirection designed to draw investigative attention to the rear access point, to create a narrative about how Nancy left the property through the back gate, to make investigators focus their forensic efforts and their surveillance review and their witness canvas on the rear of the property and the alley behind it, then the actual vehicle that transported her may have been positioned somewhere else entirely. The staging creates the story that investigators are supposed to believe. The real exit happens elsewhere, at the front, through the circle driveway, while attention and resources are focused on the back. In that scenario, the circle driveway at the front is not a coincidence. It is not a secondary location or a backup plan. It is the real operational point, the actual location where the vehicle was staged and where Nancy was loaded and where the exit occurred. The back door is theater. The circle driveway is reality. Alternatively, and this is where the dog becomes relevant again, if the back gate was the original plan and something disrupted it, some unanticipated variable like a neighbor's dog barking persistently, or a neighbor stepping outside, or a security patrol passing through the alley, or any number of things that could compromise a rear exit, the circle driveway becomes the improvised solution.
The rear exit was compromised. The plan had to change. The vehicle moved to the front. The exit happened through the circle driveway, leaving impressions in the decomposed granite that were either recovered before the scene was disturbed or were not. Either way, whether it was staged misdirection at the back designed to hide a front exit or a disrupted original plan at the back that forced a pivot to the front, the circle driveway at the front emerges as the operationally significant location. And the evidence from that surface, if it was there and if it was recovered properly and if it was preserved and documented before degradation occurred, is potentially central to understanding what happened and to identifying the vehicle and ultimately the people involved. Two investigative threads that appeared to point in opposite directions, back versus front, actually pointing at the same conclusion from different angles. The front driveway matters. The front driveway may have been the critical location. And the front driveway has a decomposed granite surface that presents significant forensic challenges for evidence recovery. I want to be direct with you about what we do not know, because this channel does not present speculation as fact, and you deserve the honest version of where the evidence ends and the inference begins. We do not know whether the FBI recovered tire impressions from the circle driveway. It is possible they did. It is possible they conducted that work in the early hours of the investigation before the drone footage was being shot, or during periods when the drone was not overhead, or at night, when oblique lighting work is actually easier because you have complete control over artificial light sources. We do not know whether they attempted to recover tire impressions, and if so, at what point in the investigation timeline that work was conducted. Was it day 1? Was it day 3? Was it after the scene had already been accessed multiple times? We do not have that information. We do not know whether impressions, if recovered, matched a known tire pattern in the FBI's database. It is possible that excellent impressions were recovered and that they matched a specific tire model and that investigators know exactly what kind of vehicle they are looking for based on that evidence. We do not know whether the surface of the circle driveway was protected or disturbed before forensic processing, and if disturbed, to what degree. Was it cordoned off immediately? Was it crossed by investigators before anyone thought to protect it? Was the degradation minimal or substantial? We cannot answer these questions from outside the investigation. We do not know what the FBI knows. We do not have access to the investigative file or the forensic reports or the evidence logs. We are working from what has been put on the public record through official statements, through media reporting, and through expert analysis of available footage. What we do know, what is fully verifiably on the record, is this. Maureen O'Connell, a named former special agent with the FBI's evidence response team with decades of experience processing complex crime scenes and recovering forensic evidence under challenging conditions, analyzed the available drone footage of Nancy Guthrie's property, and did not see in that footage evidence that tire impression work had been conducted in the circle driveway during the periods when the drone was operational and observing the scene. She identified the decomposed granite surface as a significant forensic complication for impression recovery under the conditions present at this scene, explaining in detail why DG presents challenges and what specific techniques are required to overcome those challenges. She identified the circle driveway as her leading professional assessment of where the vehicle that transported Nancy was likely staged based on tactical considerations and the operational logic of how abductions are conducted. And she raised, carefully, explicitly on the record, the concern that if that forensic work was not done in time before the surface degraded or before the scene was accessed in ways that disturbed the evidence, a potentially critical piece of vehicle identification evidence may be unrecoverable. That is not community speculation. That is not anonymous sourcing. That is not a theory from an online forum. That is a named, qualified forensic practitioner with impeccable credentials making a specific, substantiated professional observation to a named journalist on the record about a real and ongoing case. It carries the weight that that pedigree implies, and it deserves to be treated accordingly by anyone following this investigation. Nancy Guthrie disappeared from her home on February 1st, 2026, in the early morning hours. Somewhere, a vehicle was positioned to transport her away from that property. That vehicle, by the laws of physics and the nature of how vehicles interact with surfaces, left evidence. Tire impressions in the decomposed granite of whatever surface that vehicle was parked on. If that surface was the circle driveway at the front of the property, as Maureen O'Connell believes based on her professional analysis, then those impressions could potentially identify the make, model, and specific characteristics of that vehicle. The critical question that O'Connell raised and that remains unanswered, is whether that evidence was recognized as critical in the early hours of the investigation, protected immediately from disturbance, and recovered using appropriate forensic techniques before the surface degraded or before subsequent activity at the scene destroyed the impressions. Maureen O'Connell cannot answer that question from outside the investigation. She does not have access to the information that would tell her definitively whether that work was done. But she raised it. She put it on the record. She explained why it matters and what the stakes are. And the fact that a career FBI forensic agent is raising concerns about evidence preservation on day 67 of an ongoing investigation tells you something about the complexity of this scene, about the challenges investigators face when working in desert environments with granular surfaces that do not preserve evidence the way more forgiving surfaces do, and about the narrow windows of opportunity that exist for recovering critical evidence before time and environmental factors make recovery impossible. If you have information about vehicles in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood on the night of February 1st, or in the days before when someone may have been conducting reconnaissance, if you saw anything unusual, any vehicle that didn't belong or that you hadn't seen before, any activity that seemed out of place or suspicious, any person who was in the area without clear reason to be there, contact the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI. That number is 1-800-225-5324, or contact Pima County Sheriff at 520-351-4900. Over $1 million in reward money is waiting for information that leads to finding Nancy or to the arrest of those responsible. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She went to bed in her own home, believing she was safe in a quiet residential neighborhood where she had lived peacefully. She deserved to wake up the next morning. She deserves to be found. She deserves justice. And the evidence that could lead to that answer, the tire impressions that could identify the vehicle that took her, might be sitting in an FBI forensic file right now, recovered from the circled driveway in those critical early hours, photographed with oblique lighting and proper scaling, analyzed and compared to the tire database, used to narrow the investigation to specific vehicles and specific suspects. Or it might have been lost to time and surface degradation before anyone knew to look in that specific location with the specific techniques required. Either way, Maureen O'Connell asked the question that needed to be asked. She raised the concern that needed to be raised. She put her professional credibility on the line to say publicly, on the record, I was looking for this evidence, and I did not see signs that it was recovered during the periods I could observe. And this community will keep watching for the answer. We will keep tracking every development in this investigation. We will keep bringing expert analysis from people who know how this work is supposed to be done. And we will keep asking whether Nancy Guthrie received the full measure of forensic investigation that her case deserved.